Welcome. It gives me a lot of pleasure to present to you an overview of the biodiversity crisis, conservation biology, this not particularly well appreciated aspect of the global environment. I really want to give you just an overview of a fairly complicated issue. Look, basically, what is biodiversity? It's a concept that is a term that's used a lot but not well understood. Where does it occur? What is this crisis that we're all talking about? What are the primary threats to biodiversity? There are many. And why is biodiversity important? Who cares? And I'd just like to end the overview with give you a sense of this new and growing field of conservation biology. So let's get started here first with what is biodiversity. Biodiversity is a term you'll see in the media a lot. It's obviously a contraction of the two terms biological and diversity. It's only about 15 years old. It was coined very, very recently. Looking at the slide, I realized that I'm not going to read through this definition for you, but there are many definitions for biodiversity, but I think this one is the best one. I like this in a practical sense. Biodiversity is this living savings bank for Earth's successful genes, a bank that holds some 3.5 billion years of life solutions to the problems of surviving and competing on this planet. Why I like this definition is that it really captures the deep sense of time, all of the evolution of life over many, many millions and even billions of years to the present time, where we have with us sharing the planet a very interesting set of other species. These are just the tips of the tree of life extending above the sands of time. Most species that ever evolved are extinct, but we now share the planet with some other fascinating life forms. And this is essentially this collection of all of life, including us, is biological diversity. Biodiversity is actually a fairly complicated topic. First of all, it extends from a whole hierarchy from genes to ecosystems and beyond. And just let me start at this lowest level. Perhaps, for example, you and I are different. That is a good example of biodiversity at the level of individuals. Single changes in nucleotides in the genome can have huge changes to morphology and behavior. Here's just an example of land snails. These are all individuals of the same population. They're just collected off a beach in the Caribbean. And you can see the tremendous variation that occurs just between individuals, coded by small genetic variations. Here's an example right out behind this studio, are salamanders of two very different morphs, striped and unstriped here. These are members of the redback salamander group. One does much better on drier, warmer soils, which is the unstriped morph. The striped, the red one there, does much better on moister, cooler soils. This is the variation that natural selection and evolution works with, and this is very important. This is the grist for the mill of evolution and change and adaptation, these variations among individuals. So this is an important component of biodiversity, and as you might expect in the age of climate change, the unstriped morph here, the one that does better in warmer, drier conditions, is becoming more common than the striped one. Evolution in action here based on differences among individuals. We also find differences among populations that are an important part of biodiversity. For example, these are differences, all, believe it or not, these are all members of the very same species, Brassica oleracea. These are all basically small differences among individuals and among populations that we have enhanced and augmented through artificial selection to produce this wonderful variety of crops, cole crops, so Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi, cabbage, cauliflower, all the things that we take for granted in the grocery aisle at the grocery store, and yet we've long forgotten that they're all perfectly compatible members of the same species for interbreeding. But just a sense of how important this variation at this very fine scale is, differences among individuals, among populations, for evolution and change of life over time. Diversity among species, these are basically lineages or lines of evolution of life that no longer really cross with one another. Those salamanders can breed with one another. The cole crops can all interbreed. When you get to the level of species, you've got separate evolutionary trajectories, species that don't regularly lineages that don't regularly interbreed with one another. This is what we usually think about as biodiversity. In the public's mind, this is what they equate biodiversity with. Species diversity is absolutely staggering on Earth. These are the really stable lineages that persist through time. It's very interesting, though, our planet is still essentially unexplored, which is really fascinating in the context of our massive achievements in exploration of outer space. We still don't have a clue how many species there are on Earth. About 1.7 million, getting on 2 million species have been formally described through a very elaborate process of describing each one. But as far as we know, there's 10 million total. Some people guess 30 million. There's a few estimates up to 100 million. We've got a very, very long way to go. And as you can see, just at the rate at which we are doing this cataloging of life on Earth, 15,000 species per year, which is quite an accomplishment, but it'll take us 600 years to maybe do an entire inventory. So we barely know biodiversity on Earth, which is fascinating unto itself. There are some great misconceptions. For example, vertebrates account only about 1% of total species. So if we look at the grand scheme of the composition of biodiversity at the species level here, this is a much more accurate view of what we've described to date. Here, each square equaling about 10,000 species. And you can just see, for example, the vertebrates, the birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, these things that we're very familiar with really comprise a very small part of the pie. Whereas the bulk of described species are insects, the little things that run the world, flowering plants, other plants, many invertebrates. This is where we're headed when we do a complete, this just gives you a sense of what we've described to date and what we have yet to describe in all likelihood. These proportions of the pie will shift. But I just wanted to give you a sense of where species diversity really lies, again, especially in the invertebrate and the plant world, and how far we have yet to go in terms of cataloging what miraculous forms of life that we share the Earth with. Biodiversity in the definition doesn't end there. It extends further up this hierarchy from genes to ecosystems. This is another example that is very much lost on the population, what we refer to as taxonomic diversity. This is one step up from species diversity, and it refers to basically, take a look at this particular organism here. This is a very obscure lizard off the coast of New Zealand. It's called the tuatara, or sphenodon. It's, at first glance, it's what it is, just another lizard. There's lots of lizards on Earth, right? And what's the big deal about this particular one? And that really has been the prevailing attitude toward the tuatara for many, many decades. Well, look here. What's the big deal? There are indeed 3,000 species of lizards on Earth. There are 6,000, almost 7,000 species of lizard snakes, and another group that we don't hear much about, the amphisbaenians. But here they all are. If you look at how they're all related to one another, this huge clade, as we call, separate from the birds and the crocodilians and the turtles, there's this massive group of species here. Well, take a look up here. This is the tuataras. And the tuataras are basically one. It turns out there's actually two species. They're hidden, but they represent half of all the evolutionary diversity that you find in aggregate in all of these almost 7,000 other species. So in one sense, one tuatara is worth 7,000 other lizards in terms of its evolutionary history, its genetic distinctiveness. And so not all species are equivalent in this sense, and this is where this concept of taxonomic diversity comes from, is that they encapsulate different amounts of evolutionary history, and we might want to, for example, prioritize protection more for tuataras than for any one of the other 7,000 lizards, snakes, or amphisbaenians. So that's a good example of taxonomic diversity that also extends actually at the higher levels. As you remember, species and genera, but there's also families and orders and classes and phyla. Phyla really the highest level of organization and classification. The marine realm, all of the oceans and estuaries and such, are a great example of biodiversity at this really high level. And I'll just make the quick point here that basically the marine realm doesn't have a lot of species. It's not particularly species rich, but what is there is very, very unusual. It basically is found nowhere else. And this is just an example of things like ctenophores. There's priapulid worms, sea urchins. We could go on and on and on, all the bizarre marine forms out there. Not a lot of diversity, but such weird sorts of forms of life that we don't really find anywhere else, that the marine realm becomes special in this way, not at the level of species richness, but at a level of families and classes and orders and phyla. And this is yet another component of biodiversity that is worth being aware of and worth protecting. Taking this up one further level, then, ecosystem diversity refers to when we start to look at how species organize themselves into predictable occurrences, particular groupings. And they do, we can talk about the spruce fir forest of the north, or the deciduous dry forest of northwestern Costa Rica, what have you. There are very predictable groupings of species that occur. Sometimes you can argue that they're just thrown there together. They happen to like the same physical conditions, and they're just basically at the same space and time, and nothing more than that. Other times they develop very intricate relationships with one another and true dependence. But whatever the case, ecosystems are predictable, have predictable compositions of species, groups of species, and they unto themselves are worthy of protection. So there are some very, very rare ecosystem types, for example, very rare bog or fen types of bogs with unique species of orchids and very rare species of butterflies, for example. But ecosystem diversity is also a very perfectly legitimate part of the biodiversity puzzle. I use this example here from New York State, where it's mostly a forested, agricultural, and urban suburbanized state, but we do have a vast protected area with about 40 acres, 20 hectares or so of a very unique ecosystem type, which is basically alpine tundra. It just sits on the top of a few mountains here in New York State, and it's very, very unusual. It has species that occur only in these particular rare spots. And so these alpine summits of mountains are a recognizable part of biodiversity, and they're very, very worthy of protection as a group of species. Two more dimensions here to biodiversity, and this is sort of moving up and out of the biological hierarchy, but cultural diversity. We're more than just our genes and genetics and what we pass on from one generation to the next. We also pass on a lot of information. For example, elephants. Elephants retain an immense amount of information about geography. For example, you're all familiar with the story of when a drought hits, the water hole dries up, and all the little elephants look to the old matriarch, who trumpets and leads them off into the countryside. She has a memory or a recollection of a more stable water hole that she visited 30, 40 years ago, and she saves the herd through her knowledge. And this knowledge is passed on. Especially vertebrate animals have vast amounts of information that is critical to their survival and is passed on from one generation to the next. So cultural diversity is a big part of this. And I just want to end here with our definition of biodiversity just to point out that we also are a product of biodiversity. And it's very interesting when you go around the world, you see the very factors that create species diversity, all this diversity we've been talking about, are also the things that create human cultural diversity. Warm conditions, a lot of islands and mountain ranges that keep things separate and let things evolve, whether it's different genetic lineages or different language groups or different cultural belief systems, what have you. It's really fascinating that the hotspots for biodiversity in terms of species, richness, etc., are also the hotspots for cultural diversity. And similar, the very factors that are eroding biological diversity are also the same factors that are eroding human cultural and language diversity at the very same time, because they're tightly tied together. That, I realize, is a lot, but that all of these issues and dimensions combined deliver us this definition, if you will, of biological diversity, from genes to ecosystems and even into cultural and information sorts of systems. And next, we will talk about where biodiversity occurs.